All right, thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. I think this is one of the last talks that probably a lot of you will see. I think this is the last one in the room here today as well. So thank you very much for sticking around and coming and seeing Megan and myself. Let's start off with a couple of introductions, just so you know who both of us are and who you're listening to. We'll try and keep this light and pretty entertaining, hopefully, for hopefully your last talk today. So Megan, I'll get you to introduce yourself a little bit.
Yep. So my name's Megan Roddy. I have a couple roles. So here today I'm representing SANS, our cloud security program. I'm a co-author with Josh of Forensics 4509, and I teach that course as well as developing other cloud content you can find online. And then during the day I'm working as a senior security engineer at IBM, doing very detection engineering centric things.
And then myself, I'm Josh Lemon. As you probably can hear, my accent is not from the US, so I've flown in from Sydney, Australia. Along with Megan, I'm one of the co-authors on our cloud forensics class over at SANS. But then during the day, I'm also the director for the managed detection and response team at Uptycs. And then also, when I have some spare time, I also do some consulting still on incident response of people who have crazy incidents in the cloud still. So I kind of keep my foot in both the worlds of training and doing MDR, but then also helping people directly that still have issues in the cloud as well. So that's a little bit about us. We still work in the field, but also teach in the field as well. And I guess today what we really wanted to do was try to show you what you need to be aware of if you are planning to do cloud forensics, if you currently do cloud forensics, but you might be looking at one of the new clouds that you might be going into. We want to try and give you some information around what to prepare for and what to be ready for, or what to kind of consider as part of it. Because there are kind of this concept of where is the evidence in one particular cloud, but also there's these odd edge cases as well when it comes to trying to get evidence out of the different clouds as well. And as they're all different vendors, they all have slightly different edge cases and slightly different parameters and configurations as well. So what we're going to try and do in the time left available, we're going to try to go through AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, M365, and Google Workspace. So this will be very much sort of a presentation under rapid fire to at least give everyone something to take away or give everyone something to potentially go back and use or go and talk to their own teams about. All right, this is our sort of obligatory disclaimer from RSA, so we'll kind of keep skipping through that. Now, when it comes to doing cloud forensics, this type of concept doesn't work. Who knows what this is? Just a show of hands in the crowd. All right, well over half the people. A lot of people are like, yep, I know what that is. We played with those kind of 5-10 years ago, even further. This is a write blocker. This is how we used to do forensics on-prem, where we go and get a laptop and we go and pull the hard drive out of it, and then we go and do a disk duplication of that through a write blocker. Now, I never had the experience of having a keyboard with a write blocker. I thought that this was a bit of a luxury when I saw this photo. I was like, man, if someone had a keyboard, they were doing some really good forensics or working for a really well-paid company here. I still remember punching the up and down arrows to actually get the different labeling sorted out. But when it comes to the cloud, this concept of doing sort of a bit-for-bit duplication of a drive doesn't really exist anymore. The concept of doing cloud forensics really falls into the world of actually doing log analysis, because that is by far the bulk of where evidence sits when you're looking at the clouds. Now, how much of this is log forensics varies depending on whether you're looking at SaaS or whether you're looking at infrastructure as a service. It does change a fair bit. If you're in the world of SaaS, software as a service, like your M365 and your Google Workspace, as you'll kind of see in a minute, you are very much in the world of just log analysis. There's very little outside of log analysis that you get to play with. When you're in the world of infrastructure as a service, log analysis is still a huge part of doing incident response and forensics in the cloud, but there are other evidence types that are available as well. Not a huge amount, but there are other ones that you need to be aware of. So yes, when we talk about cloud forensics or cloud incident response, we're really talking about log forensics or log analysis. You might kind of go, all right, this is cool, easy. We've done log analysis for years. We've looked at firewall logs. This is kind of old hat for us. But the challenge is there's all different types of logs, and knowing where to get those logs and what they look like are slightly different. Now, a concept that we try to impart with people is this concept of how to go looking at different types of logs. And what we try to say to people is start with authentication logs. Those IAM logs are kind of key to starting doing things like incident response or even threat hunting inside of the cloud as well. It's a good starting point because it allows you to go, all right, this behavior or this user account is highly suspicious. Let's look at that and start to slowly go down the rabbit hole and figure out what is going on as part of it. When it comes to doing forensics in the cloud, understand that you're at the scale of the cloud as well. You could be talking hundreds of gigabytes or terabytes in terms of the logs that you have to go looking for. So it's no longer just a matter of, hey, let's just pull up all the logs and punch in an IP address, because that is hard work. You need to start to narrow down what you're going looking for to start with. So we recommend people start with authentication logs, and we separate those out because authentication could be separate to where the cloud actually is. You might be using a third-party authentication service. After that, we tell people to go and look at the cloud platform logs. Now, in most cases, these are generally on by default. You'll see how that goes in a minute. But cloud platform logs generally are on by default and tell you what's going on with the platform itself. Think of these as those logs that say, hey, this user account is trying to do something. Underneath that, we have things like cloud resource management logs. And this is where someone is interacting with a service or a resource inside of the cloud as well. So after we know auth, after we know what someone's doing, we can start to look at a specific resource or resources that they touched. Then after that point, things start to get a little grey or a little fuzzy in terms of what is and isn't turned on. Things like logs produced by resources varies. And this is where you might go, all right, well, I can see that there's something unusual going on with containers. I'm now going to go and look at the container logs, which are logs produced by a resource. Or I might want to go and look at the bucket logs, and they would be logs produced by the bucket itself. And then underneath that again, kind of going back up towards the top there, we have inter-resource logs as well. These are logs inside of the resource itself. And this really applies to virtual machines. So think about it from the perspective of, I could see that Josh's user account has spun up a virtual machine and has created it and given it some firewall rules to expose it to the internet. He's logged into it and he's started to do things inside of that virtual machine. Those logs inside of the virtual machine are what we would call the intra-resource logs. They're logs that are produced by the operating system or something else. They don't always exist for every resource. But that's kind of the path that you're going down. Now, getting these logs to start with is generally not too hard. We're going to show you a couple of ways to do that. But analysing them is where things start to get a bit unusual. What I've done here is I've pulled from Google Cloud, AWS, and Azure what are called flow logs. Now, think of these as a little bit like traffic logs or summarised traffic logs. They're all showing almost the same type of thing. And I've just put them up here in their native form. The first thing you'll notice is they are all very different from each other. They all lay out the information differently, and they also present the log differently as well. And this is the first challenge when it comes to investigating. What do we actually do to consume those logs and actually get them into a state that's usable? Now, yes, you do come across cases where someone's just using one cloud, but by far, the majority of cases that I work on nowadays are multi-cloud. So you have to be able to deal with this type of concept as well. So that's one thing to kind of think about to get going. All right, there's some fundamentals. Let's start to take a bit of a look at Microsoft 365. So this is the software as a service part of Microsoft 365. Think of this as Exchange Online, Teams Online, SharePoint, those things which are provided by Microsoft 365. Now, to get evidence out of there, our key area is what's called the UAL, the Unified Audit Log. Now, the Unified Audit Log has information around what users and admins have done inside of M365. However, it was not turned on by default prior to October 2021. So if you stood up your Microsoft M365 tenant prior to that date, October 2021, the logs are off by default. So it means there are no logs for you. Now, Microsoft have said that they are slowly trying to go back and turn these on. I can tell you from a case I did 2 weeks ago, there was a tenant I worked with, and those logs were still off by default. So that process hasn't finished. So if you have your own version of M365, go away and check that the logs are turned on, and I'll show you how to check that in a minute. If it occurred after October 2021, when you put in your credit card or your billing details, they should be on by default, but you can go and check those as well. Now, generally speaking, for enterprise users, these are like E3 and E5 user accounts, you've got these logs for 90 days for an E3 account or a whole year for an E5 account. So we can kind of see those start to sit there. Now, a challenge with these logs is the authentication logs, which I said at the start are the most important, or the thing where we start. Those authentication logs are delayed by up to 24 hours going into that UAL log source. So if I went and pulled the logs today, I could be missing the last 24 hours worth of logs. And that's just because they take time before they get tipped into that UAL location. Now, there is another location you can get authentication logs faster, and that is from the Azure AD logs as well. If you went to a separate location, which is where your Azure AD logs are held, they are on by default for everyone. There's no October 2021 issue here. However, they're on by default for only 30 days. So you could go and pull the UAL logs, provided they're turned on, and you could go and pull the Azure AD logs, and that should then give you that 24-hour window that you're missing inside of the UAL logs. If you are not using an enterprise account, your Active Directory logs are only on for 7 days by default. So a lot of the times the challenge might be that you go to investigate M365 and find out the UAL logs are turned off, which is bad. And then you go over to Azure AD and go, well, hopefully the logs here are turned on, and they should be by default. And then you might figure out, well, this person doesn't have an enterprise user account. They've only got 7 days of authentication logs. It tends to be much longer than 7 days that threat actors have been inside the environment. So things to consider there. UAL logs and then Azure AD logs as well. Now, to understand whether your UAL logs are turned on or not, there's actually a PowerShell command you can use as part of that. So you can connect into M365, and you authenticate via PowerShell, and we'll give you a link to show you how to do that right at the end of today. And there's this command called get admin audit log config. Now, this is what it looks like when it's all turned on and it's all happy and working correctly. This is 90 days worth of UAL logs. This is ideally what you want to see. It gives me some information about when it was turned on and when it was last changed. The one that you don't want to see is this one here. And this one is somewhat confusing because it does say the audit log enabled is true. And you might kind of think, all right, well, the UAL logs should be turned on. But then you go and look at log level and it says none. There is no log level set. Or down the bottom there it says unified audit log ingestion enabled is false. So even though it says that the age limit is 90 days and the logging enabled is true, you need to go look for these other fields, the audit log ingestion enabled and the log level field as well. And if those are all turned off, you'd also have a blank location there for the first opt-in date. That's the first time you turned on the UAL logs as well, which you haven't at this point in time. So they're the danger ones. We don't want to see that. If you see that, you need to go and enable those logs. So for those of you using M365, your takeaways from today are go and check that the UAL is enabled. For those using M365, your takeaway for tomorrow is go and check UAL is enabled. That is by far the biggest challenge that I see when doing M365 investigations. If you're a consultant, it's the first question you should be asking. If you're an internal team member, you should be asking this question tomorrow. Friday, yeah, it is Friday. Yeah, you should ask this question tomorrow at work. After this, go and consider things like how you'll get those logs out of the UAL. And we're going to show you some guides of how to potentially do that. Consider doing things like exporting and storing the AD logs. Remember, they're only held for a maximum of 30 days by default if you have the enterprise account. As investigators, we like to push that out a bit further. Maybe try and get it to 90 days or 1 year to match your UAL logs as well. And then determine how you'll convert both those log sources or how you'll collect them in an emergency if you needed to. If you're in the consulting world, you might want to figure out how to do that really rapidly also. After that, you might want to figure out how you want to do any types of enrichment, and then also how you would go and do threat hunting. How do you normalize those logs also? So those are your takeaways for your M365 users. All right, let's talk about Google Workspace.
Perfect. So, Google Workspace. Can I get a quick show of hands from people in the room? Is anyone in here a Google Workspace customer? Oh, wow, that was more than I expected. Usually it's not a super popular one compared to 365, but it is Google's 365. So we have to look at what logs we have. Starting with the concept of retention and lag time. And the reason we bring this up is if you're doing an investigation and you expect logs to be there, you need to know when you expect. For example, the Azure AD logs. Not missing an hour's worth or 24 hours worth of login logs is a big deal if it's an active investigation. So, for Google Workspace, we have some variations. In terms of across the board, what's the standard? We typically see 6 months retention. That's considered pretty good for the cloud vendors. We saw Azure AD, they'll only give you 7 to 30 days depending on how much you pay. Google says, doesn't matter what tier you are, 6 months of logs you have. A few exceptions being the fact that email transaction logs, so seeing what logs were sent and received, they do limit those to 30 days. The email search of the inbox, so this is not what happened with the email traffic, this is what emails currently exist in the inbox. There you have no retention limit. If a user keeps an email for 6 years, you can still retrieve that email via email search. So a few exceptions to the 6-month rule, but generally your Google Drive logs, your chat logs, things like that will all be 6 months. The final exception to mention, a very cool but dangerous tool that Google Workspace offers, not dangerous, cool tool, Vault Data is a tool, it's an e-discovery tool. So you can pull back emails, pull back files, very useful as you have employees leaving and you need to get that data back or you're performing an investigation. And with Vault Data, your retention is configurable. So if you say this email needs to be retained for the next 6 months because of an investigation, it will stay 6 months. If it says delete it after 2 weeks, you can have it gone after 2 weeks. So email search, transaction logs, and Vault are your 3 occasions where you're gonna see a little bit different than that 6 months. But in general, Google's very nice to us. 6 months retention and searchable from within your admin portal. Lag time depends on the event types. Most of them, again, real time. Awesome. We don't have that 24-hour delay that Azure AD had. If a user logged in, we're probably going to see it pretty quick. But there is a few delays. The login logs and the OAuth logs, for example, so those authentication stages, we might have a delay of up to a few hours. Through my own testing, it's definitely very variable. Logins do take a little bit longer, but typically they're pretty quick. And then the last 2 that take the longest time are the reports and chat. Chat, we were just talking about this earlier today. Why chat decides to send 3 days, wait 3 days to send you logs, we have no idea. Reports, we can justify a bit more. The reports feature in Google Workspace allows you to bring back these analytical, statistical outputs of things about your environment. So you can talk about how many files a user has shared externally, how many users have MFA enabled, how many files in your Google Drive have PII in them. They're pretty cool reports, but those reports take time to generate. They have to run the search, bring back the information, and spit it out. It's not these real-time events streaming. So those you will see a delay. If you're pulling a report, you want to know everyone in your environment who has 2FA disabled, and you just told them to enable it yesterday, just because you pulled the report, there's probably people who have enabled it and that report hasn't been regenerated. So again, this is all about the awareness of I'm in an incident, I'm pulling back these logs and these reports. Do they have all the information I need? If there's a big lag time, if there was a short retention time, you might not have the data you need. With regards to types of logs, we touched on them here, but we're going to go deeper into what are the specific logs that Google Workspace offers. Here on the screen, the ones highlighted in purple are going to be the ones that are most relevant to you as a digital forensics investigator. They're going to be the ones that we commonly investigate in incidents. So for example, Gmail, Drive, those are logs we will probably look at in an incident. People are phishing via email, exfiltrating data, looking at sensitive files. The other ones, calendar, chat, Meet, those kinds of things, that's all going to be varied on your usage. I can also say as someone who has looked at these logs, not as much love has gone into the context they contain. So you might not get as much good info. Whereas Gmail and Drive, they're pretty good at recording context. So those are app specific. Going up a level, we see the admin actions. So in the middle there, we have different things admins can do. We have the admin log, which is about like kind of changes to our environment. So the organization is now enforcing 2FA. A email routing rule is set up for the organization. The user accounts audits is more focused on what user account changes are being made, users being added, removed, things like that. And then OAuth token is whenever those OAuth applications are being used. Everyone has probably used one application that gives you the option to sign in with Google, give Google permission to read your calendar or open your emails, things like that. During that exchange, if an OAuth application is being leveraged for that authentication, you'll see the activity occur. You'll see this application requested the ability to use this user's Google Drive account. So very valuable, and it's a technique we've seen used in the wild for attacks. And then a couple other login methods not as commonly used, other admin things, group and SAML. They're there if you need them. You're just not going to see them as much based on our personal experiences. And then user log events is going to be probably our biggest one that we want to look at because that is where the login logs for users are stored. That is where we find out when a user logged in, logged out, failed attempts, things like that. We also see the user level account activity. For example, if a user sets up a auto forward address personally on their account, which is a common method of persistence for email compromises, is that will be in the log. They set up an additional email. So purple are the ones you should focus on. Gray are there, and they may provide value if your use case presents it. But in general, we see that Google has individual logs for each of these different applications, each of these operating domains. And the frustrating part is that when you log into the UI, you can only look at one set of logs at a time. That is probably my biggest gripe about Google Workspace Defer is there's no single pane of view. So you need to know what logs contain what information so that when you go to search those logs, you know where you're going. So to get them out of cloud, we can look in the portal. Like I said, not ideal due to their fragmentation. But since Google Workspace is a Google product, we have this convenient integration with Google Cloud. With the switch of a button, we can say all these logs that are coming into Google, send them to my Google Cloud account, where I can now search them. I can use PubSub to export them to my third-party tool. Very easy to configure. The unfortunate part is that it is only a subset of the logs. You'll see out of the dozen or so logs I put up on the last screen, all we're going to receive here are the admin activity logs, which is a great one, user log events. Again, both of those super valuable. Groups, we said, not as often one that we're going to see. Same with SAML. And then access transparency events is an interesting one. I haven't seen a major use case related to it to forensics. I don't know if Josh has, but that's going to be Google accesses your account for any given reason, and they're telling you, hey, we accessed your private data. So those are all able to be shipped to Google Cloud with the switch of a button. They're retained based on your cloud bucket settings, so you can retain them for the period that you want, and they're stored under the organization. but you are only going to get a subset. So your use for this depends on how your deferred procedures dictate your review of logs. Maybe that is where you start. Maybe you want them shipped off, retained for a long time. At least you have your triage point for those login logs. So since we do have people using Google Workspace in here, let's look at the same thing that Josh explained, but for Google Workspace. So for Google Workspace, he said turn on the UAL. Luckily for us, our logs are on in Google. We don't have to turn on those additional logs. But the question is who has access to that logs? You want to make sure that on the two ends of the spectrum, one, they're not overly accessible. You don't have a fleet of admins who can review these. That's just not good security posture. We want least privilege. But you also want to make sure that your security people can get those logs when the time comes to need them. So you might have locked it down and there's only 3 admins in the organization, but if you didn't give the permission to the people who need it in an incident, it's going to cause even more delay in getting that response. So first thing to do, make sure you know who can access them, make sure that access is controlled and provided where needed. Then in the next 3 months, start process things. So you saw in Josh's, it'll be a theme over all these takeaways we give you. There's process level things. So develop your process for how you're going to obtain those logs. How are you going to get them? And then get your team to look at the logs and understand them. Again, these logs are very dispersed, separated. They all include different information. If you start looking at reports too, that's even more information. If you don't understand these logs, when an incident comes, you're losing time with your investigators trying to interpret the data. So there's a lot of, in the Google Drive and Google the Gmail things, lots of very specific actions and subfields and sub-values that can be seen and mean different things. Make sure they know that if they look at a log, they know what it says. And then afterwards, before, in Josh's section on 365, we talked about like those retention times, shipping them off, saving them. It was more urgent because they were only going to retain them for 7 days or 30 days. We get 6 months, so you don't have to panic yet about your messages expiring. But ideally, you're thinking more about your long-term retention, how you can get them out of Google Workspace, keep them for yourself, and have them accessible. So as you go on, as you've got these processes in places, now we can talk, okay, well, we're ready to respond within the cloud, but if we've got a long-term incident, how are those logs ready for us?
Okay, let's look at infrastructure as a service. We've spoken about M365 and Google Workspace, which are our SaaS platforms. Now let's talk about Azure, which is the infrastructure side of the Microsoft ecosystem in the cloud. Now, when it comes to Azure logs, there are 5 predominant log types that they have. The first 2, tenant and subscription logs, are on by default. But they're on by default for often a restricted period of time. It's usually about 90 days for most customers. So they're turned on. The tenant logs are going to hold things like authentication events and activities that have occurred to the overall tenant. So big changes to the tenant or admin level changes. The subscription logs are basically what occurs inside of Azure when you do something in what they call a subscription. And this basically means that whenever you do something that has some sort of financial impact in terms of your billing, it gets logged in the subscription logs. Now, just be aware, if you already play with Azure, this might make sense to you, but you have subscription logs per subscription as well. So if you have multiple subscriptions, you'll have multiple subscription logs. Both of those are on by default, which is a good win for us. The ones which are not are resource, operating system, and application logs. And these are those lower layer logs or lower level types of evidence that we might want to look at. So resource logs are, again, logs generated by a resource. So if I wanted flow logs to know network traffic movements, they're off by default. I have to go and turn them on. If I want to know details around who access specific files inside of a storage container, they're off by default as well. You can also, inside the Azure infrastructure, suck out the operating system logs as well. So if I've got Linux or Windows running, the Azure cloud can natively reach into the virtual machines and pull those logs out and hold them back inside of Azure. Perfect for our threat actors that like to do things like go and clear logs when they land on a virtual machine. It means you've got them sitting back inside of Azure. The one down the bottom there are application logs. Now, for select applications inside of Azure, it will actually extract applications running on top of the operating system inside of a virtual machine. So think about this from the perspective of a Microsoft web server running on Windows Server. So it will actually extract those Microsoft web server logs and pull them out of the virtual machine and hold them back inside of Azure as well. These are kind of these lower level techniques that can be really helpful when it comes to investigation, but also really helpful when you want to retain evidence that threat actors know that we go looking for as investigators and try to blow that evidence away. Now, from there, how do we access those logs? Well, the tenant and the subscription logs are pretty flexible. We can actually retain those for a lot longer. We can send them to storage buckets. We can send them outside the platform, or we can just view them inside of the web console itself. So they're pretty flexible in terms of storage and trying to extend the life of them. When it comes to all of the bottom three that I had on the previous slide, you can only send those to a storage location inside of Azure. So you can't auto ship them out of the platform. You have to kind of write your own code to go and do that after it lands in a storage location. Okay, so that's a quick insight into Azure. A couple of takeaways here. Make sure that you are extending the life of your authentication logs out to a storage location. This is relatively simple to do inside of Azure because inside the console, you can only physically view them for 30 days. And a lot of the times, we want to extend those out to 90 days or a year, depending on what your storage requirements are. This is really easy. You can actually turn on a switch and you can say, hold these in a storage location for 365 days, and it will just auto-rotate them for you. That's all you need to do. Really, really good recommendation to give to other people using Azure or for you if you're using Azure as well. After that, go and determine which of the log sources which are not enabled by default might actually be interesting to you. Things like flow logs, knowing what network traffic moved around, is super, super interesting and is often ones that we try to recommend people to go and turn on, but it's off by default. Determine how you're going to collect these logs, depending on whether they are just stored natively or whether you've pushed them to a storage location. Figure out how you're going to go and collect those if there's an emergency or if you need them really fast. And then down the bottom there, if you have multi-subscription tenants, consider doing things like pushing all your logs into one central location. So as a responder, you've only got one place to go and get those logs out of Azure. All right, moving on.
Yep. So next on to AWS, one of the big ones. Very similar to Azure, very similar to that investigation wheel we saw in the beginning. We're going to see different levels of logs. So at the first level, what we want to talk about are these control plane logs. So this is controlling the resources in your account, whether it be an S3 bucket, a user, a VM, an EC2, any of those things. You're managing your resources. In this case, this example, we have an S3 bucket created or a new user created, a new VM created. Same things with these being destroyed. All those actions taken on the resources at the management level are gonna be logged by default. You have them, they're being sent to CloudTrail, and CloudTrail will retain them for 90 days. From there, you have to decide whether you're gonna retain them longer elsewhere, but at least they're there. 90 days back, you can look into these resource management activities. But there's a lower level, not turned on by default, that is also disabled by Azure in default, and it's this data plane. It's these specific interactions with those resources. The resource was turned on, now what happened? The S3 bucket was created, you'll see that, but if you do not turn on these non-default logs, you will not know when someone opened the bucket, accessed the files, deleted files, changed things. You won't know when a database was accessed, things like that. So these more at the resource level, you're not gonna have by default. It's on, it's off, that's what you know from the logs, you don't know what happened after. We also have additional services that are a bit more niche. They're usually added on, not something you have happening by default, and so they have their own logs, and their logs are off by default, so you have to enable them. But again, logs that may be of value. Kubernetes logs. If you're not using containers in Kubernetes and AWS, obviously this is not for you. But if you are leveraging Kubernetes, there is a logging feature, but it must be turned on to get those logs to CloudTrail. And then same with load balancing and flow logs. Flow logs, we showed in the beginning, it's a great way to get metadata of network traffic. They are turned off by default, but if you're investigating network activity and that's going to be a value to have, then look at enabling those. If you have additional appliances you're hosting, AWS, you can deploy a cloud firewall. You can deploy a cloud load balancer into your environment. Those firewalls, those load balancers, they'll have their own logs, but again, are off by default. So taking this list, you need to understand what's relevant to you, what's worth enabling, and enable. From a collection perspective, I said those default logs, they all go into CloudTrail. CloudTrail is this service, it stores the logs, but then you have to get it out, especially if you want to retain. So you have some options for that. At the top, you can send them to an S3 bucket, just like you can send logs to an Azure storage account, a blob storage or something like that. You can say, get all these logs into an S3 bucket. And then your S3 bucket has controls where you can set retention policies, you can monitor it, things like that, permissions. So S3 bucket is one place to send it. There's limitations. Obviously, you're going to pay for the storage. Searching through buckets is not as efficient as searching in a log platform, but it's there. There's also many AWS internal services. We've got Glue and Athena, for example, that will take your CloudTrail logs, parse them, put them into a data table that you can then query and investigate. So there's some built-in services that you can redirect those logs to if you want to leverage them. Again, keeping in mind they're a business. If you're sending your logs to their service, they're probably charging you for it. Other option is kind of related, external SIEM and APIs. Those two is like, let's get them out of the environment. We have a SIEM deployed. We have a Splunk deployed. A lot of the SIEMs are going to now have integrations with AWS. Enter your API key, configure these things, magic, it's connected, your logs are coming in. In the same way, if required, if your SIEM or your log analysis tool vendor, or you just want them out of the cloud into a syslog server you have in the closet, any of those things you can collect via API. That's the same way your SIEMs are doing it. Make those API calls, pull them out. And then lastly, the web console. So there are places that you can search the CloudTrail logs in AWS, once again, with limitations of it's an in-cloud tool. They're giving it to you to be nice. So it's not going to have the same retention search period. It's not going to have the same filtering capabilities, et cetera. So with that, the quick wrap up of what you should learn from this. Look at that table of non-default events. Do you have load balancers? If so, you probably want to collect those logs. If you don't, you probably need to ignore it. Go through those data sources. See what you can be collecting that you should be and are not. That's your first step. Make sure it's enabled. Then, moving on, you can start looking at how you store that data. You can put it into an S3 bucket. It's easier to retrieve, to send to another platform. You can assign the retention and the configurations. How are you going to collect it? So, okay, you might have put them in S3. You might be keeping them in CloudTrail. Now let's say we need to get out. An incident's happening. I want the raw logs. How do you do that? Have those processes in place documented. And then check for coverage gaps. If you have a large AWS infrastructure, if you have looked at an account with a large infrastructure, the division of regions, the division of all these applications, EC2, S3, have you checked that you have logs for EC2 in US West and EC2 in US East and S3 in Asia and S3 in Asia 2? Like, these environments get complex, so just because you hit enable one place does not mean you have covered your bases. So have your team understanding that. Do we really have coverage? And then lastly, we talked at a bit more niche, very high, somewhat high volume storage bucket access logs. That's why I said we can see when someone creates a bucket. We can't see when they take those files out. Now, would it be smart if you're doing all your storage on S3 to say record every access to every event, or you have a static site and now every time someone loads the site that's recorded? Possibly not. That's a lot of storage requirements. So understand which of our S3 buckets are worth monitoring for access. Oh, well, finance has a bucket where they keep all our historical finance records. That one we should probably know if people are touching it. And then Athena and Glue, I mentioned, it's a way to parse that data, put it in an easily searchable system. It's a tool you can use, provided in cloud by Amazon. That's something you can look at as you move forward in your capabilities with log analysis in AWS. Our last cloud.
All right, on to Google Clouds. This is our last one to have a look at. And what we've tried to do here is break up again the different log sources that exist inside a Google Cloud and whether they're on or not by default. Now, the way to probably best look at this is the first group up there. If you look on the far right, you'll see there is this underscore required location, which is where they're going to. So we have a number of logs, things like admin activity logs. So these are any write events that an admin performs. They are on by default. Even better than that, they're not charged, but they're locked on by default. There is no way to go and turn those off. So I can see everything that an admin has done. I can see anything related to platform events and login events as well, regardless of whether a user is an admin or just a standard user account as well. So those are all enforced and turned on by default. Now, a little bit further down, there's one there called policy denied audit logs, and that is on by default, but can be turned off. And what that represents is whenever someone tries to perform an action inside a Google Cloud and they're denied access to do that. It then generates a log when someone does some sort of event that is a denied type event. Now that's on by default, but you are charged for it. So you can go and turn that off if you really want to. There are other types of things that you can turn on, like admin read, data read and write, and there's also manual or custom logs that you can push into Google Cloud's login API. Now, let's see how many people have been listening. Everything that we've kind of said so far around number of days of how long logs are logged for, let's do a bit of a quick poll to kind of get people, I guess, sort of amped up before we finish off this afternoon. Who thinks that the Google Cloud logs are retained for 30 or less days? Be the raise of hands. Okay, we've got one person, maybe two. All right, who thinks they're retained for 100 or less days? Okay, we've got a few more hands, probably just under 10 there. Who thinks they're retained for 200 or less days? Oh, getting close to half the room. Okay. Who thinks they're retained for more than 200 days? Okay, we've got about, okay, so probably a bit over 10 there, maybe 12, 15. All right, the logs which are on by default are retained for 400 days. So those logs, those admin activity logs, the login events, they are retained for 400 days by default. And you are not charged for that, and you can't turn that off either, which is brilliant. So it's a huge sort of space of time that you have to investigate there. Now, you can actually push that higher than 400 days if you really want to, but 400 is pretty reasonable as an investigator. The default logs, when you start to turn other log sources on inside a Google Cloud, by default, they're held for 30 days. In fact, if you hold them for 30 days, you're not charged for them at that point. If you produce less than 50 gigs worth of logs per month, and you don't hold them for longer than 30 days, they're free. So you can go and do things like experiment and turn on logs. This is probably one of the best places to go and practice as an investigator and see what different logs do. If you push them above that or you use more than 50 gig per month, you then start to generate costs with holding those logs as part of it. And also we can do the same with our user-defined logs. We can go and turn on additional logs and start to push them out as well. Now, turning on these logs inside a Google Cloud is relatively simple. You can go into the IAM and admin section, which kind of sounds a bit unusual, but that's where the logs default to, or where the default settings are for the logs. Under audit logs, inside of IAM and admin, and then you'll see that you can, at the top there, you'll see set default configuration. You can turn that on and go and alter the default configuration. If you want all read and write events for everything, you can turn that on with that button. If you just want read-write events for your storage locations, you could scroll down the list there on the right-hand side and just go and turn those specific ones on as well. So it becomes really kind of simple, and then they just flow into that default location. They're default held for 30 days as part of that, but again, you can extend that out if you want to. Your maximum lifetime inside of Google Cloud Logs is you can hold logs for up to 10 years. That's your maximum retention period. But you can actually push that even further if you really wanted to by exporting them out of Google Cloud as well. Although, I'm not sure you'd really want to. If you're holding things like those key login events for 400 days by default, that's pretty good. All right, some things with Google Cloud. go and check, go and see if there are other log sources that you want to turn on which aren't on by default. There are a lot of really good ones that are there by default, but you might want additional services turned on, which would be handy. The other thing is to consider centralizing your logs inside of Google Cloud. Google Cloud has this concept of projects, which is basically like an isolated space for different resources. And the logs in each project is kind of treated separately. You might want to ship all of those to one location to make your life easier as an investigator or as a defender inside the environment. You might want to also figure out how you're going to collect those logs in an emergency, although we'll give you a really good resource for that in just a second. And then also understanding those logs. They are heavily detailed. They're kind of these crazy embedded JSON arrays. So there is a little bit of unstitching you have to do to figure out what's inside of all those logs as well. And then maybe consider pushing some of those logs to a storage location if you want to hold them in a storage bucket separate to the default locations of where they're held. And then after that, you might want to consider how you're going to push these out to analyze these inside of a SIEM or inside of an analysis tool as part of it. Okay, that's pretty rapid fire. Now we're going to give you a resource thing here, and we'll talk about this, but if anyone wants to ask questions, if you want to start making your way to the mics, that just might make things a little bit easier, and also so we can hear you and the rest of the room can hear you as well.
Yeah, so these are just some resources we've gathered. We actually gathered them as part of our coursework, hence the URLs. But the first one is a GitHub repo. We have tools, we have commands, we have scripts divided up by cloud. Almost every one of the clouds, we have some sort of acquisition script or command to help you get those logs. If you also look on the SANS blog, I'm in the middle of a blog series about extracting the logs. So AWS and Google Cloud are up. You can grab the other ones as they release. The poster is a big, if you've ever seen a SANS course poster, is one of those, about yay big, PDF format at that link, and it has a cheat sheet of different things, log retention times, commands that are useful, event types worth looking at, things like that. So cool little cheat sheet.
And then the last one there, which is SOFELK. That's probably a much larger topic on its own, but that is a free tool that will allow you to ingest all the different log types that we've actually looked at today. So we maintain that along with Phil Hagen, who is actually the original creator of this tool called SOFELK. It's essentially an elastic stack inside of a virtual machine with pre-made parsers and some pre-made dashboards. And if you go and use the tools from GitHub, you can suck the logs down, put it into the SOFELK VM, and then actually start to visualize and search those logs as well. I like showing people that so they've got some way to potentially do this for free or to do this on research so they can actually go and play with those logs themselves. But really cool tool. There's a lot more information on SOFELK if you want to go and read that online. Alrighty, thank you very much for listening today. So we'll take some questions. I can see a couple of people up already.
So my first question is there a way we can monitor continuously if some of these configurations that we are enabling one time are not disabled by mistake or something later? Like how you had a PowerShell script, I can understand that's there for Azure AD, but are there other ways that we can have monitoring enabled around these configurations?
I will say the thing that immediately comes to mind for me, my focus being on Google Workspace, is they do have like a security health dashboard that talks a lot, not just about logging settings, but about all the settings related to that. And they also have a lot of custom rule functions you can do based on activities. So it's possible there would be a way there to like create alerts or view visuals of, hey, this thing should be enabled but isn't. But I'm not sure any specific method. API call, like without your own personal development of like a cron job with an API call, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it changes for each platform as well. Some of them are better and worse than others. Like Google Cloud, you can't physically turn off the default logs. Those ones which I showed before, which are on by default, there's no way to turn those off or to shorten the 400-day limit. For things like M365, if you have an org admin account, you can actually turn off the logs, which is just crazy that you can turn off those default logs. But I mean, as Megan was saying, you'd have to, particularly for something like M365, you'd probably have to poll for that and actually check that on a regular basis. The turning off of some logs in the other clouds is logged as well. The challenge is you would see that log event occur and then logs would start to disappear at that point in time. So it kind of varies depending on cloud. Some of them do it much better and some of them don't, unfortunately. And some of them do have a decent security dashboard now as well, like Workspace, Google Cloud does. AWS is getting much better at doing it, although AWS is on by default and you can't really turn it off. But if you turn on other logs, you'd probably have to write your own polling or use an additional tool to try to figure that out when they get turned off.
Just one more question. The Azure resource log, which is not enabled by default, do you recommend enabling that for all resources? Or it's something that you should pick and prioritize production and production resources or high priority resources and stuff like that?
Yeah, those resource logs are the logs produced by resources. So things like your flow logs, or it could be a load balancer log, you have to really assess those on a case-by-case basis. Like if it's your production stack, you probably want to keep a close eye on those and probably want lots of logging turned on. If it's more of your development team that are doing development or engineering, you might only want to put logging on things that are on the edge where people could potentially get out to the internet or people come in from the internet as well.
And then it's also going to vary so much on your org because it does come down to a financial thing. The cloud, we got unlimited storage, so like we can store it all there, but is your business willing to pay for it?
Yeah.
Do they think it's worth paying thousands to millions, depending on the size, extra in case something happens, or would they prefer you prioritize to budget save? So.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hey there. Great content, thanks. I was wondering if you know the permissions that you need, the roles that you need for the Azure AD and M365, or Azure and M365 logs.
Yeah, so let me just repeat that, make sure I've got it right. So the permissions needed to go and view M365 and Azure AD logs, or the Azure logs. Okay, I'll try and keep this quick because it could be a bit of a long answer. You need essentially the audit view event, or the audit view permission. Now, the challenge with that is you need it in both the Azure infrastructure side, so in the Purview console, and you need it in the Exchange admin console as well. So you have to give, so if I was to provision Megan with an audit view only permission, I have to do that in both Purview and then Exchange admin console as well. Because the way that you access those logs, if you're doing it via PowerShell, you actually come in via, and this sounds unusual, but you come in via the Exchange management console and then you actually pivot over to Purview to pull the UAL logs out. So that's why you need the permissions in both sides. But that's assuming view only, you don't want to interact or change it or alter anything.
Okay, and same thing for Azure specifically? Not Azure AD, but Azure?
The same thing applies for Azure as well.
Okay.
Yep.
Excellent, thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Great presentation. I have a couple questions. The first one is, if we are using Microsoft CASB, which is the Microsoft Defender for cloud apps, and we are forwarding the authentication logs to them, do we get extra retention if we are using that?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
My limited knowledge on CASB is that you're going to pay for it. So
It's included in A5 or E5. So we
in
can
that
always-
license type. I don't know.
I think by default it's 180, but yeah.
You can forward it to a log analytics workspace and you can
I think once you start forwarding it around, you're going to start paying for it.
Okay.
But I don't know, to be
No worries.
honest,
And
off
then
the top of my
the
head.
other one was the workload logs. Can we forward that to CASB as well, or?
Do you mean things like the as a function logs?
Yeah, the UAL, which you said, like
UAL
the
workload.
UAL.
So the drive,
oh.
OneDrive.
Yeah.
Yeah, the UAL logs, not that I've seen, no. Like this is one of the, I guess, limitations of UAL at the moment is you can't kind of go, all right, put this in a storage location, or you can't kind of go, send this to like the event hub to then forward it out. You can pull it via API, and there's lots of development going on at the moment with people writing tools to pull that out via API. One of the kind of annoying things as a really kind of unusual edge case is myself and Korstian, who also does a lot of research in M365 with us. Him and I were kind of working on cases and collaborating with each other on two very separate cases. And then one day we started talking to each other, like, can you actually pull the logs? Like, what's going on here with the API? He's like, no, I can't pull it either. Then we were talking to another person who teaches the class as well. We're like, oh man, Microsoft has like taken down the API to pull logs out. And it was offline for about 24 hours. We're like, oh, I hope this is not a permanent change, this is just an outage. But API at the moment, or PowerShell, is really where you have to get to the UAL. Yep, hopefully that changes, fingers crossed.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
That's all right.
E5.
Yep.
Hello, guys. Hi, Megan. Hi, Josh. So my question is like, in a multi-cloud environment, how can organizations evaluate the effectiveness of the log collection and analysis process as a whole, and like what KPIs to be looked after?
Oh man, that's a big question. Okay, so if you're in a multi-cloud environment, my strong recommendation is to try to centralize the logs in a location. It doesn't, a lot of people kind of get held up on that concept. It doesn't mean that you have to push your, like let's say you had all 3 infrastructure clouds. It doesn't mean you have to push Google, Azure, and AWS all to one location, but at least push them to centralized locations in their own tenant or in their own. So if you had Azure, push all of your Azure logs to one location that is locked down just for the investigators. It does then mean that you have potentially 3 locations to look after, but I think holding them natively in the platform they came from is probably a better scenario. There's some really clever things I've seen some customers do where they'll actually use Google Cloud's login API, which is actually super flexible, and I've seen people push them over to that, so then they hold it all inside of Google. But I think you just need to think of what's going to be simplest to get to without getting too complex.
Which I also think depends on the level of integration of your multi-cloud, because some organizations just like, oh yeah, we're everything AWS, but this one project or application uses Azure for their stuff, in which case it's like, what's the percentage chance that if an incident happens in the one cloud, you're gonna need all those logs from the other cloud? If it's like everything's so intertwined that given an incident, you're gonna have to look at every cloud, then maybe it is worth centralized in a single location. But if it's like, oh, well, some incidents might deal with there versus here, then that approach of just centralized per cloud and have to hit the ones relevant might be more feasible.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is make sure that when it comes to analysis, you can at least analyze them all in one platform. So SoftElk, which I put up there before, you can put all those clouds that we've talked about today into that platform, and it means you can pivot really quickly. You're not jumping through 3 different panels and 3 different consoles to look at those logs as well. In terms of things like metrics, I might park that question because that's a bigger answer, but we'll hang around for a little bit if you want to talk
Thank
more.
you, Josh. Thank you, Megan.
Great content, thank you. I had a question because most of what you covered the infrastructure and to a certain extent the infrastructure plane. Can you actually give a few recommendations about the appli structure? Because the reason I ask that is you see a lot of managed compute come up in these cloud service providers, right? Like Synapse, for example, even the Kubernetes clusters, managed Kubernetes clusters, getting logs on those layers becomes incredibly complex. So do you have any recommendations for that?
Yeah, so you're looking to me to tackle that one.
He said
Yeah,
Kubernetes,
yeah, he
so I was
said
like,
Kubernetes.
oh, that's Justin.
Yeah.
Yeah, managed,
like
Databricks even,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
I mean, to answer that, the answer to that is a long answer to kind of preface this a little bit. There are things like when you look at Kubernetes, particularly across all the different platforms, like we've already seen today, they vary again. Like who has it on by default, who's collecting different things, who's collecting things at the node, who's collecting things back at the actual central controller as well. So you really have to look at those. If you're, I'm trying really not to push the class, but if you're keen to know more, we do cover it in the class, and that is over 5 days of content essentially. So, but yes, there are other log layers lower down. There's also other things too, like doing rapid analysis on virtual machines as well. So there's some clever things you can do with your Kubernetes nodes, like you can snapshot those, look at the actual snapshot itself while the node itself is still running. But those are kind of large topics as well that kind of need to be covered separately. Yeah. But yes, that is all possible though.
Yeah, it also goes back to the cloud because like we said, for example, the Windows web server logs, there is just an easy flip on the button, now it's going to Log Analytics workspace type thing for Azure, but you're not gonna find that on a EC2 Windows VM potentially, so lots more, always depends in the cloud.
And it depends which vendor as well.
Yeah.
all right, thank you.
That's all right, thank you.
Thank you for taking this great presentation, by the way. When it comes to on-prem storage and stuff, there's a lot of these vendors that are talking about immutable storage, right? In your guys' experience, when it comes to tampering with logs in the cloud, do you guys see that as a concern or not really?
The only time I've seen tampering is usually turning it on or off.
Okay.
I've definitely seen, and that was nation state threat actor that has done things like turned off the UAL logs just because they knew what they were doing, which was kind of clever. I've never seen someone, or just blow away logs as well. Like I've seen, but I don't know that was, like I've kind of seen that more from an extortion perspective where they just start to blow away buckets which do have storage logs. I don't know if that was necessarily done because they knew that was containing CloudTrail logs at that point in time. So I've seen it at that level. I've not seen anyone go into like the file inside of the storage bucket to try and wipe out individual logs. Is it possible? Yes, I definitely would say it is possible. But I've not seen someone try to go to that level either.
I gave a webcast a couple weeks ago about like the benefits of the cloud to investigators, and one of them was talking about logging storage, and I think part of the reason we don't really see that as much, like we talked about how like you can't really timestamp, like you can't change the timestamps, and also the logs themselves are harder to edit because it's typically more logged down. Like typically when you know you're creating this log storage bucket, it's not like a thumb drive you're storing on or a hard drive. Usually by default that's going to be read-only because like who would need to be writing to system logs, and so the IAM control over like how micro that IAM control gets, typically it's just, yes, you can edit logs, you can edit files, but it's going to be more locked down than someone just had a hard drive that is in a server that the logs are on.
Yeah, but yeah, I guess like the only tampering I've seen is people turning on or off.
Yeah.
And the same would apply like if you're streaming the logs out to another platform somewhere. It's much harder at that point, I guess, to tamper with them. But again, like you could break that stream connection, and you kind of know, all right, well, we haven't gotten logs for the last 20 minutes. What's going on? Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
It's all right.
Yeah, maybe you touched a bit on this topic about analysis of different other forensic artifacts. And you mentioned already that it's completely different kind of broad topic about analyzing the snapshots of containers, for example. But based on your practice, I would assume the forensics in the clouds is not limited only to the logs, right?
No.
So, and maybe just mentioning, so how often you actually need to be involved and pulling artifacts like VM snapshots, Kubernetes, Docker images, containers, and that kind of stuff. Other artifacts which kind of forensically sound.
I think it's, so in terms of what other artifacts would people pull on a regular basis outside of logs, I think it depends on the incident. Like, I was saying earlier today to another colleague that threat actors don't really care whether they hit a VM in AWS or they hit a VM on-prem. Like if it's an Exchange server that's vulnerable to like proxy logon or something like that, they don't care if it's AWS or if it's on-prem. I guess if you're dealing with an incident that is a compromised system as opposed to the entire infrastructure itself, then at that point you would want to do things like grab the snapshot and then start to analyze that snapshot, or potentially look at snapshots backwards in time if you were holding multiples of those as well. So there is that side of the more traditional host-based forensics, but there's some other, we just didn't have time to cover them today, but there's some other cool artifacts as well which are outside of that host compromised scenario. So there's this thing called the Cloud Shell inside of Azure, and the same thing pretty much applies inside of AWS and Google Cloud as well. And that Cloud Shell gives like a command prompt in the browser to interact with the actual platform. There's evidence left behind when people use that Cloud Shell and potentially commands that they've run inside that Cloud Shell as well. So there are other little pieces of artifacts scattered around, but you would really use the logs as a starting point, and then really things like pulling those small artifacts or the snapshots, that's when you're really starting to get in-depth forensics at that point in time. At least that's kind of been my experience. Is there any other ones that you can
you're
think
always
of?
going to triage from the logs, I feel like. Like even if you're doing an on-prem investigation, you're starting with your SIM logs like from an endpoint, and then you go, oh, that's the endpoint that's compromised, let's hone in. But yeah, I don't think you ever just like jump straight to the box and you're like, we're imaging this and running a full disk image analysis on it without like having started at the logs. So I can't think of anywhere it's like the logs don't get involved. Like,
Yeah.
And it is like the main thing I think about when I'm like other non-log artifacts. It's snapshots of VMs, particularly.
Yeah.
The objects themselves from storage in rare cases could be useful.
Yeah. I guess the big difference though with the cloud is you can do things at scale much, much faster. Like I know one organization that can pull hundreds of thousands of snapshots all at once and then run Yara SIGs across all of them really, really fast. That concept outside the cloud doesn't I mean, You could just run it live on a system, but then you've got potential system impact to it. You can't just snapshot systems and then run Yarra SIGs on snapshots as part of it. So there is definitely that advantage to scaling in the cloud, even with the analysis side of it from our perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe just a short second question, because if you will take clouds, right? So probably you can't imagine DevOps teams are managing and logging in via CLI and creating via GUI, via virtual machine, right? It's always kind of SPN, Azure Pipeline, CI/CD, which kind of can get triggered, I don't know, 1,000 times per day, which you kind of flood all the logs with kind of SPN, created VM, deleted VM, created again, created 100 another ones. So what would you be, from your perspective, I think, look, we still need to look at the logs, but DevOps environment in CI/CD thingy, right? You can't just ignore it, and to a certain extent, it adds additional complexity to a certain extent.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, we talked about this yesterday a little bit. Like, that starts to go down the path of detection. Like, how do you
and threat hunting.
Yeah,
Like-
and threat hunting, yeah. But also, like, building detection inside of the cloud to kind of ignore those automations, or when you start to see unusual automation start to occur as well, because like we've seen people compromise automation systems also.
And that's why regardless of vendor on what you take away from today, there's always that bullet point of make sure your DFIR responders know the logs.
Yeah.
Because someone's gonna see those logs and they're gonna be like, oh, there's this weird thing happening every 1 hour, maybe it's beaconing traffic. No, it's just a CI/CD pipeline like running. So like that's the first thing I thought of when you saw that, is like digging through that is part of knowing your environment and then knowing that from your environment.
Yeah.
There's no solution to that. That's why there's a bunch of marketers over in North and South Expo selling you on their
selling you
AI
everything.
tool that can identify anomalies, is because there isn't an easy button of like filter out all the good without understanding at the human level what that good is.
Yeah, it's like going, oh, hang on a sec, we've got this compromised AWS config user which is touching everything. This must be something really bad going on. You're like, well, actually, no, that's just normal AWS activity. That's how things work, But again, that's understanding those logs.
You see the same thing on-prem. Like on-prem, you're gonna see scheduled jobs running. You know, sysadmins used to create scripts that they pushed via GPO to run hourly to change some settings, and it might look abnormal at first, but if you investigate, it's normal. So you're gonna find the same thing with your cloud logs. There's gonna be things at first you're gonna be like, that's super shady, and then over time it's like, okay, no, that's normal, filter it out, default, we already know, don't pay attention.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.